In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Laudetur Jesus Christus. Welcome to the Meaning of Catholic. I'm joined today by Dr. Levi Russell. Dr. Russell, happy to have you on.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So Dr. Levi Russell is a Catholic convert, Easter 2007. He earned his PhD in economics from Kansas State University. He is interested in promoting Catholic social teaching through applied research and economics education. Levi leads the Local Commerce Promotion Program, and he is the host of the weekly Catholic Economics podcast. But his greatest achievements include his wife and 3 children. So, Dr. Russell, thanks so much for having on. Today, we're going to continue the conversation about Catholic economics. This is part of a bigger conversation of Meaning of Catholic about America as an idea and as a political economic entity, which has influenced the Roman Catholic Church, especially at Vatican II. It became the tipping point against the Pian Magisterium's rejection of the French Revolution and sort of an embracing of the American Revolution, as Ratzinger says, as sort of this model of the modern state. So this is part of the bigger conversation because economics has a big role to play in the political, social, modern questions that have been dealt with by the church since the French Revolution. So on Monday, we talked with Eric Sammons about Catholic libertarianism or free market or capitalism, different terms for it and different shades of it. But today we're going to talk to Dr. Russell about distributism and talk about what that is, what that means. We'll try to also look at objections to distributism. And then eventually we're also going to have a debate in the future. I have not worked out all the details of that, but we will have a debate on this issue on economics between generally this perspective, a distributist sort of perspective, and generally the free market perspective. So we will have that. Stay tuned for that part. So we're going to start off, Dr. Russell, with talking about what books should we read about this topic? What has influenced you, and what would you recommend?
Yeah, so I obviously, as my in my university professor role, I have access to a lot of the paywalled journal articles and stuff like that. So if you can find access to the work of Rupert Ederer or Bernard Dempsey, that would be really good. Those are 2 really good economists who write stuff that the average person can pick up and understand. But on the Leo Institute website, so Leonine Institute for Catholic Social Teaching is an organization I've started with a friend, and we are putting out some policy papers and all kinds of stuff. But we do have on the website a Catholic Social Teaching reading list. It's under the About Us section. The first book that I list there is Ethics in the National Economy by Father Heinrich Pesch. And the thing is this is a very good book for someone who just wants to get an economist's view of Catholic social teaching and things like that. I think one of the challenges we have is that certainly Chesterton was not an economist. Belloc was a little bit more, tuned that way. So we get a lot of this distributist ideals from, or even policy suggestions from these 2 men, but there are a lot of other people that have great things to say about it. So Ethics in the National Economy, it's published by IHS Press. You can buy it from them. You can also get it from Laredo Publications. Very reasonable priced, $10 or $15 book. And it's a very condensed version of a lot of different things that Pesch talks about. He talks about the morals, the ethics discussion, and he also talks about sort of economic theory and policy and things like that. So I would say Economics for Helen is a really good book by Hilary Belloc. So that one again is very, I think, readable, and he sets it out in a way that I think an economist would. We have a whole list of things on here. Distributism for Dorothy by Father Lawrence C. Smith. So there's a lot of things on here that you can check out, and I would just say check out the list.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, I just put the link in the chat, so take a look at that. I'll add it to the show notes. So let's start off with some basic definitions and branch into the theory. So Dr. Russell, can you define what you mean by distributism, and let's get into what it means.
Yeah, so my view is that distributism is a concerted effort to faithfully apply Catholic social teaching in our world through policy, from the government at any level, at all levels, through our interactions as producers, consumers, merchants, and through our actions as, in you and I's case, right, the heads of families, right, fathers, and mothers and children as well, right? So it's, my expertise is in economics, and so that's what I focus on. But, I think distributism goes beyond just economic policy, but those are the things that I'm most interested in, and that I think need a bigger voice today. I mean, there's a lot of work, and there are a lot of great people out there. Joseph Pierce is fantastic, and he has a wonderful grasp on sort of the stained glass windows and the gargoyles, right? The beauty of Catholic social teaching. But I think when it comes to sort of the hard policy discussions, I think there's a limit on how many people are out there with, with a really strong understanding of economics talking about these issues.
Okay. And so nobody can disagree with applying church teaching, but the main critique coming from the Austrian libertarian kind of school is that the teachings do not take into account sufficiently economic law. And they assert that their theories are economic law, and they compare them to the force of gravity and physics and that type of thing. Right. And so first of all, I think that there is something to say about that, because there is a certain limit to the church's power. They can infallibly declare something about a scientific theory. So we can all agree about that. There's a limit to that. Now, what do you say to that objection of applying Catholic social teaching?
Right. So there's so many things to say. One of the first things I would say is that, this coming from specifically the Austrian school. So when I was in graduate school, I was very interested in Austrian economics. I would say that's probably the reason why I went on to get a PhD, because I was so interested in Austrian stuff. Austrian theory. I read Rothbard's book. I read a ton of Austrian stuff. I have an article in an Austrian journal. So I'm pretty well versed in the arguments that are made, both popularly and in their academic work. And I would say that I think one of the biggest problems they have is there's sort of a cognitive dissonance, because while they want to say that that economics is, like you said, these laws of nature, it's kind of interesting, because if you that can be juxtaposed against their I guess theoretical problems they have with using mathematics and economics, right? And so if economics is a law of nature, well then, to some extent it should mimic physics or something, or chemistry or biology, some of these disciplines that use a lot of mathematics. And yet they insist that we don't do that. So Rupert Ederer makes this point very well in a book review of Tom Wood's book that I believe was on your previous stream this week.
Right. Yeah, the Culture Wars review that he did, I believe. Yeah. Yeah,
in 2005. So you can read that, and it's a very, very long book review, but he does make that point that it's it's kind of strange. And then we also have this idea that there are a lot of folks in the Chicago school, which is considered a free market school, but it's quite different from the Austrian folks. And we have people that were very well known in the Chicago tradition who didn't really want to call it a science. They called it a discipline, right? They called it, they wanted to treat it more like a sociology or something like this, right? Where we're trying to use logic in its place, but that these so-called laws are not fundamental. They're contingent on the legal framework that we put around things. And so when, we often hear, oh, well, you can't implement this policy because that policy, it goes against the law of supply and demand. And it's like, well, okay, I understand what you're saying, but really all you're saying is that there's a moral trade-off according to the law of supply and demand. And that, this is all predicated on the system we live in, but it's not dependent on, something fundamental like, neutrons and electrons.
Okay. And let me ask a specific question. And I do want to get into some of the basics of the Catholic social teaching, but I want to field one more sort of objection, because this is sort of on the epistemological level, where we're gathering the Catholic social teaching and we're asking, how do we apply that? What do we apply? And so to give an example that Tom Woods brings up in his book, for example, is talking about the just wage. So right. I think we could probably agree that just wage is at least a teaching, but the Austrians will say, well, that's against the economic law because, and then they launch into a praxeological example, and they say, right. Well, if the just wage is imposed on an employer, he has to raise his wages on all these employees, and then he's forced to then fire some because this is an economic law. Now he has more expenses. So then he has to, so basically the point is, which I think is, there's a logical simplicity to it. I think, maybe you disagree, but I think there's a logical simplicity to say that, well, if we're forcing an employer to raise their expenses, basically, they're going to have to cut costs and cut employees. So the idea is just wages increase unemployment, and that's an economic law. So would you agree with that analysis as an example of applying an economic law to basically dissent, if you will, or disregard Catholic social teaching on the just price, for example, just wage?
Yeah, I would agree with that characterization, because I think what's actually happening is there's a moral premise underpinning what they're saying. And there's a set of assumptions, and typically, right. So if you push that a little bit, then what you get, the objection that you get is that, well, everybody, what do you want everyone to be poorer? And so that's, that's typically the objection you would get. And I would just say, to address that specifically. Yeah. So I just had a column and just had a piece in the Washington Examiner talking about the just wage and a family wage. And so would the implementation of a family wage, which would essentially make the pay of a full-time employee dependent on the number of sort of tax dependents that they have in their household, right? So you and I, my wife doesn't work outside the home, so I have 4 dependents, right? So then my salary would be adjusted based on the number of dependents I have. And so, would this kick people out of the labor force? Well, sure. And rightly so, right? I mean, the point of the policy is to have one earner per family, right? Rerum Novarum starts off, Rerum Novarum, one of what we would consider to be the founding document of Catholic social teaching. Now, obviously, there are other writings that are relevant, but this is thought of as kind of starting Catholic social teaching. And the first thing he talks about is, a man earning a wage. And so, the family, again, is the fundamental unit of society. And so who cares if, things shift around in labor markets? I mean, is it going to make some people poorer? Sure. But we can deal with those distributional issues on the back end. Markets aren't infallible, right? Markets come up with arrangements that don't meet the standards of justice. So,
okay. And let me ask a corollary question as an aside, because I've heard this. Ripperger asserts it, and so does E. Michael Jones, and he says that feminism had all the Marxists and others who are pushing women to the workforce and basically forcing them to leave the home, many really against their will, has basically caused a decrease in wages, so that there's there's far more workers, so therefore the wages go down. Is that an accurate assertion?
Right. So, this is one of the challenges of empirical economics, right? So how do we look at inflation over time? How do we evaluate the usefulness of a wage, right? Do we look at it at the household level, or do we look at it at the individual level? And, if we have things like, Elizabeth Warren 15 years ago wrote a book about the 2-income trap, where she didn't like the fact that, that both parents had to work, and her whole thesis was about some very specific academic point or whatever. But it was really interesting, today, because today you would hear Tucker Carlson talking about that. So if you want to get, I think, a deeper dive into this, what I would suggest is reading Oren Cass's paper. It's fairly short. I think it's 7 or 8 pages long, called The Cost of Thriving Index. So just Google Cost of Thriving Index. And what he does is he shows you, he says, okay, here's a basket of things that we think everyone needs, right? Everyone needs, this is a basket of things that everyone could afford fairly easily about 50 years ago. Education, housing, things like this, right? A vehicle, so that we can get around, right? So it's very much, in the sort of modern perspective, right? We're not talking about, 3 acres and a cow or something, right? And what he does is he tracks the cost of those things, that basket, right? And so this is sort of in place of some kind of inflation measure that, we can always have squabbles about inflation measures. So he uses the cost of this basket of goods over time, and he compares it with the average male wage or median male wage or something like that. And he shows male wages, female wages, and sort of the household combination wage, and just shows that the ability of the average man or the average woman or the average family to afford this basket of goods has declined over time. Right? So really, it doesn't matter what your standard is in terms of income, right? Whether you're talking about men, women, or the quote unquote average household, right? The ability to afford this basket of what we would consider to be some kind of a modern necessity has declined. And so to me, it's this is the kind of thing we need to be talking about. And Oren Cass has provided the data on this. So it was attacked. Oh my goodness, it was attacked vehemently by the libertarians. I mean, it's like every day for 3 weeks there was somebody coming out with a think piece trying to take down Cass's paper.
Has there been any substantial answering of that assertion of Cass?
So, I mean, from my point of view, the only, what happens in economic debates like this is it always comes back to some kind of ethical complaint, right? So the complaint is not about whether or not these sorts of things should be affordable. It's always, or whether or not his data is wrong, right? His data is perfectly fine. Normally it's like, well, why do you think people should have to have a car? Or why do you think people should, be able to buy a house? I mean, and this to me is it's insane. You read Leo, the 13th, or you read Pius the 11th, and they're talking about how, the system needs to be, that the system should be built on the idea that people should have these things. And so the only, I guess, economic objection I've seen is that, that this basket of goods is no better sort of a measure of inflation or whatever, or this cost of thriving than traditional inflation measures are. And I think that's wrong, because the main problem with inflation measures is that they have to somehow adjust for what they call quality. Okay, so we have something called a hedonic adjustment. And so it's like, if you bought a TV in 1995, right? Let's say that TV costs $500, right? Well, you go out and buy a TV today, and maybe the average TV is $200 today, right? But there's a sense in which a TV 25 years ago is a different thing from a TV today, right? Even though they sort of provide the same general service, the quality is different, the quality of this picture is different, and all these sorts of things, right? And so if you take that that quality adjustment very seriously, there's sort of mathematical ways to try to tease that out. And I mean, personally, I just don't think they're very good. And so looking at things that, where the quality is sort of not constant, but the average house, the median house, shouldn't be completely different today than it was 50 years ago in terms of, its relation to everyone else's houses, right? Like if the average person should be able to, could afford a house in 1970, well, there's no reason why the average person couldn't afford a house today, right? There's no good reason for that. And so policy should address that if, that's something we think that is important. And of course we do.
That's interesting. I think I may have heard of the caste study once, but one of the constant assertions of the Austrian free markets is that, you know, there was, I think they make reference to one study, I think it was over the past 15 years or something like that, where it talked about global poverty, starvation poverty had been cut in half. You're probably familiar with the study. And so there is a great, and there's the overall assertion of that the Industrial Revolution just sort of raised everyone's standard of living, which is hard to disagree with. We're all driving cars instead of buggies and all that. So what would you say is the cause for Cass's assertion that the basics, what we might call, I don't know, might call the basics of life are harder to acquire? Because it appears, I mean, it just, as a non-economist myself, I would concede the point, hey, yeah, it seems like it's easier for me to get a car than it was in 1950 or 1920. What would you say is the reasons for these?
So I think here is where, again, we're going to get this accusation of socialist leveled at us, and I think not appropriately. So you said a lot of different things there. So, first of all, the caste study is only addressing the U.S. and fairly recently, right? If you're talking about, developing nations and stuff like that, these places have, tremendous challenges to deal with in terms of, sort of going through the process that much of the West has gone through over the last 200 years or so with industrialization. And then, all of the things that sort of come after that. And so, I think it's probably true to say that, this is the thing, right? Does capital accumulation, right? So the only thing I would say is that, the Industrial Revolution allowed for us to have this capital accumulation, right? At a more rapid pace than in the past. And you'll see things from, Deidre McCloskey that shows the little hockey stick jump, everything jumped up in 1800 or whatever, or 1900. And these are all references to sort of material well-being on average, right? So this, number one, is not necessarily a good way of describing the whole person, right? I mean, are we better off as a whole person, right? So, but putting that aside, and I actually did a show with a friend of mine who's a philosopher on, a lot of these things that have actually improved our lives, right? So what you'll say is, well, if we level these criticisms, right, from Chesterton or something, it's like, oh, well, do you want to undo the Industrial Revolution? And so I would say, well, first of all, no, because that's not possible. But what is it about the Industrial Revolution that's so good, right? And so people say, oh, well, vaccines and, the discovery of electricity and internal combustion, right? And the thing is these inventions don't, they may seem to correlate with this massive increase in capital accumulation over a shorter period of time, but really they're all sort of accidental, right? I mean, the discovery of electricity did not depend on how much capital we had, right? Or the use of it. Capital accumulation, the speed of a capital accumulation has nothing to do with, the discovery of certain vaccines. It has nothing to do with, the invention of the internal combustion engine. Right now, you may say that, well, you need the Industrial Revolution to make those things cheaper. And I would say, look, if you read Pesce's book, he flat out says, look, progress in economics is a good thing for us. There's nothing wrong with progress in economics. The point is that we have to submit it to the moral decorations of the church. And when we're talking about, you're saying, well, a car today is much cheaper than it was back in, whenever. I mean, I would say, well, I don't know about that, right? So, I mean, Henry Ford, the average person on his assembly line could afford to buy those cars, right? And these days, you've got to have a 6-year loan or a 7-year loan, right? At 5, 6, 7% interest, right? For the average person. To be able to afford this thing. I mean, that's crazy. That's not even close to what, things were like 50 years ago. Right. And so a lot of this underpinning this, I think, is debt and usury and the way that messes with markets to a large degree. But, I don't know. I just have a smattering of thoughts there, and it's such there's so many things that go into this, right? So if you talk about the international, we think about international aid policies, we think about developing countries and what's going on with them. Arthur Brooks had a documentary a couple of years ago about, how foreign aid was a bad thing and how it was harming these small countries because, they were losing their local markets. And hey, that's totally a good criticism. But the reality is that the, sort of international capitalism, right, where we're foreign direct investment and all these factories and all this stuff, I mean, that's also harming those economies, right? It's also harming those people's local production of their own stuff, and it's harming their own culture. It's changing the way people do things, right? I mean, up until very recently, rice was not a staple of, Central America. And now it's like everybody has to eat rice because that's what the U.S. has been dumping on them for the last 30 years. Right. So, I can see that critique of the big business. That's something that E. Michael Jones talks about in the export of pornography. I spent time in Egypt where the garbage dwellers had to move to the city, but they couldn't sell anything because becoming an entrepreneur is very difficult in the third world because you're competing with these big corporations who can undercut your prices without a second thought. So I think the big business, the critique is there. Let me get into more about because we kind of talked a little bit about the Austrians. Let's talk more about what distributism is and what is not. You basically gave a general definition of applying Catholic social teaching. Can you maybe go down some of the basics, non-negotiables in your mind of Catholic social teaching and distinguish that from what are there gray areas in that? What is it not? Yeah, so I think it's important to get the fundamentals right. And when we're talking about markets and economics, one of the big fundamentals here is this idea of freedom and liberty, right? And what I think happens is we're often told that we're supposed to kind of adopt the Enlightenment liberal perspective on freedom and liberty, right? And I think the best way, sort of rhetorically, to understand this is that, so who is the most free being, right? Well, the most free being is God, right? And so, as the church teaches us, right, in the Catechism and in many writings, previous to our current Catechism, the church teaches us that that we have that liberty, we should have the right to do what is right, right? And so, what happens with this liberal definition of freedom is it's like it becomes this negative conception, right? It's like, well, you have the freedom, to do whatever you want as long as you're not harming someone else, right? Well, that's not the church's position, right? The church's position is, no, you have to follow the laws of God, right? We have to listen to God. God is our ultimate authority on what is right and wrong, not whatever you happen to be able to do that day, right? So I very much think that it's important for us to understand that this whole idea of the non-aggression principle is wrong from the get-go. It's completely against, the church's teaching and the biblical teaching on the authority of the state, right? The state has authority. The state is not just a group of guys who, in economics, it's the stationary bandit or, all of these horrible, perspectives. Can governments do wrong things? Sure. But do we apply the non-aggression principle to the state? No, of course not. The state has authority. So these things I think are important for us when we're starting to understand how to apply Catholic social teaching. So we need to get that first. I think we need to get that understanding first. But second of all, I think when we look at these, most of the social encyclicals come to us, from the past 140 years or so, 130 years or so, and so I don't understand why we can't take these things, fairly literally. I mean, I have a quote here from, let's see, this is Pius XI. So this is from Quadragesimo Anno from, I don't know, 1931, right? Yeah. So every effort must therefore be made that fathers of families receive a wage large enough to meet ordinary family needs adequately. But if this cannot always be done under existing circumstances, social justice demands that changes be introduced as soon as possible. I mean, what is so esoteric about that? How is that not just, plain, right? if this, here's the condition, right? Here's the principle. We want fathers of families to receive a wage large enough to meet ordinary family needs. Okay. And that tells us a lot of things, right? It says ordinary family needs. Okay. Well, we can't make references to, oh, well, you're the poorest person in America, but you're very wealthy compared to the rest of the world. Sure. But that's not the society I live in, right? I don't live in a developing country. I live in the US, right? So what determines ordinary to me is what is ordinary where I live, right? So that's the principle, right? Because I think your interview on Monday was, there was a lot of this discussion about principles and applications. Well, the application is, come up with a policy that meets this principle, right? And don't mess around. And so, is that difficult? Are there trade-offs? It's like Milton Friedman said, there are no panaceas, right? Everything's a trade-off. Maybe that was Thomas Sowell. Anyway, the point is, are there going to be trade-offs? You bet. But is that, some kind of esoteric statement that we need to interpret or whatever? No, it's pretty plain. I mean, this was, not even 100 years ago. It's a very easy thing to understand. And so, I would say just wage and just price. I think those are two things that are poorly understood. I think it's easier to understand just wage, probably. Just price is more difficult. And I think there's a lot of academic work that needs to be sort of mainstreamed so that the average Catholic can understand that well. I would say usury is a massive issue. Partly because I think even in the church's teaching, it has been de-emphasized over the last 200 years or so. So to me, those are three really big issues that I think we need to keep track of. And we really need to have discussions about those and forget about talking about, 3 acres and a cow and stuff like this. Yeah.
Well, that's funny you bring up those three because I know that just price and just wage was a part of different teachings sort of by custom, I think, back in the Guild Age and whatnot. But usury has been explicitly condemned by the church since at least the Council of Nicaea in 325. And all along, I was trying to think of a more consistent condemnation of a social ill than usury. Right. So, and there's the last big encyclical or magisterial act was Vix Prevenit 1745. So can you talk a little bit more about usury? Maybe you could define usury and talk about why you think it's a problem.
Sure.
And maybe expand on that a little bit, please.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the just price stuff a little later, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good deal. So I'll save my one pushback on you for that here for a little bit later. Okay, so usury. It's very interesting. We just the Leonine Institute. We just put out a policy paper. It's a little bit long. It's about 25 pages long, but it's double spaced and all that. And the three of us really dug into what we thought were, the most popular writing in the Catholic world on usury. And we also tried to dig into other resources that seemed to have been ignored by a lot of writers. And so what we attempted to do, I think, was to correct the record on some of the concepts that are discussed a lot with usury. And we also tried to correct a lot of the record on sort of the economic theory part. And that was kind of my role. And then to sort of say, well, what's next? What do we actually do? What are the policies, or how do we go about making this situation better, right? So if you want to find that, go to leoinstitute.org and check out policy papers. And so it's the top one under there. Usury, right? So Vix Prevenit, 1745, like you said, Pope Benedict XIV. I'd like to call him the terror of usurers, but I don't know if that's a sensible thing to do. But so in I believe it was sometime in the 1820s, 1830s, the Holy Office applied Vix Prevenit to the whole church, right? So it was originally a letter to the Italian clergy, dealing with some issues that they had, dealt with there. But about 80 years later, they're sort of looking at it again. And I mean, it was a pretty extensive study. If you read the text of Vix Prevenit, it's very short, and it's on papalencyclicals.net if you want to read the whole thing. What it is they're trying to, the Pope is trying to help the folks in Italy and then later on, the rest of the world to understand how to apply usury, the condemnations of usury in the situations they're dealing with. And so, Vix Prevenit, there's a lot of weird language that's hard for us to understand these days, I think. And so when you dig in, what you essentially find is that that Vix Prevenit condenses down a lot of sort of the late medieval or whatever that period would be called, their perspective on what is usurious and what isn't. Okay. And so what essentially they come up with is if you're sharing in the risk of some kind of investment, right? Because we're using very different terms today. If you're sharing in the risk of some kind of investment, right, in a business transaction, then then whatever, then if you make some kind of just profit from that, right? So profit in general can be made on some kind of investment where you assume the risk. And this is the thing, is that Father Pesch, in his book that I just mentioned at the beginning of the show, he agrees with this, right? And he's interpreting this, and he's saying you can take out an annuity, or you can enter a partnership for a business, right? You can deposit funds with a bank, right? And in the paper, we go through a lot of legal scholarship from Brian McCall. He has this fantastic paper on usury, and we go through that and kind of explain that sort of in economics and finance terms. That he's showing us what the medieval church was talking about, or what the scholastics were talking about when they were talking about usury and what the Pope said. And the one thing I want to quibble with is you said just wage and just price were sort of these practices, but if you read this book, George O'Brien, an essay on medieval economic teaching, and one of the things that he makes very clear in this book is that the medieval law and the practice during that time was heavily influenced by the church, right? So it's not as if you get the arrow didn't run the other way, right? The medieval practice was influenced by the church. It wasn't that medieval practice was just sort of there and the church just sort of wrote it down like like they were big fans of it or something, right? So I think that's one of the important things we get from this discussion of usury, is that we need to go farther back in time to understand what was considered wrong and what wasn't. So one of the things with usury we get into is so if we're really talking about a loan, right? A loan where I give you money and I'm not taking any risk on an investment, or I'm just lending you money so that you can buy food or buy clothing or buy a house, right? A consumption item. It's not just for me to earn interest on this, right? Because what I'm lending you, money, right? What I'm lending you is not productive in and of itself, right? Money is not productive. And the example is if you see The Merchant of Venice, right? Shylock's ewes and rams are productive, right? If we sort of put them in a pen over there and we leave them alone, the natural process is we're going to have some more sheep, right? But if I put $100 in the drawer, it's no different today than it was 500 years ago or 1500 years ago, right? If I put $5 in the drawer and come back a week later, there's still going to be $5 there, right? So a loan is when I lend you money, right? And we make this distinction in the paper. We talk about, if I were to come and lend you a hammer, right? That's a completely different thing, right? Now we're talking about a rental arrangement. That's not a loan, right? They're distinct things, right? A loan is a loan of money, right? So we've got this risk concept, right? So we're talking about a business loan. Well, a business loan today is very different from an arrangement where I'm sharing risk, right? So I used to teach finance at a college, and this is one of the first things you talk about, right? So if, when we're talking about loaning, debt versus equity, right? So borrowing as a business versus someone investing and becoming an owner in the business, right? Well, the owner of the business is, their profit or their return they receive is dependent on the success or failure of the business itself, right? What we call the underlying real thing, right? Whereas in a loan, the money you earn on that loan is an expense, right? I mean, ask an accountant, right? It's an expense. It's not dependent on the success of the business, right? In its normal sort of the day-to-day of that business, the bank is going to get the return that was specified in their contract, right? And so something in VIX prevent is very important. As we talk about, intrinsic to the contract is this phrase is fussed over like crazy with some of the folks who think that that interest is allowable on loans. Of course, that is intrinsic to the contract, right? It's in the contract. It says I'm going to pay 3% per year, with monthly compounding or something, right? That is in the contract. So another thing we address in the paper is this idea of, usually the term that's used is lucrum cessans, and I don't know. I know German. I don't know Latin. So, my pronunciations are bad, but this idea of profit ceasing, right? And so what we've done here, or what a lot of people have done, tragically, I think, is they have equated this idea of lucrum cessans. In other words, the stopping of profit, right? They've equated that with what we call in economics opportunity cost. So the idea, according to McCall, in the history of this term and its use in legal scholarship, it simply means that if, let's say, you loan me money, right? So, and I'm supposed to pay you back in 2 weeks, right? So if I don't pay you back in 2 weeks, I mean, we've got a problem there, right? Because maybe you needed that money because, you got to buy your daughter a dress or something, right? And if I don't come forth with that money at the agreed upon time, well, that messes up all your plans, right? And, of course, I mean, there's some amount of justice in the fact that we agreed to this, right? And the fact that I'm breaching that agreement is sort of an offense against you, right? It's an offense against the contract and the agreement we made. So lucrum cessans or damnum emergens, I think, is the other term. And it's kind of like profit ceasing, or someone not allow profit to emerge, right? These things are in the language of Vix Prevenit, not intrinsic to the contract, right? So this is different, right? If I'm supposed to pay you back in 2 weeks, right? And again, you're not asking for interest, right? Because that would be intrinsic to the contract, right? So that's condemned as usury, okay? But if 2 weeks I show up and I don't have the money, well, when I finally pay you back, I owe you more, right? Because I breached our contract to some extent, right? So this very simply is where we go with understanding usury, right? Usury is the taking of interest on a loan, period, end of story, okay? Now, how do we interpret things, language from 400 years ago into today? Well, I think we try to do that very plainly for a lay audience. And I say lay audience relative to a professional economist, right? In that paper. So I think we want it to be a reference. We want it to be something, you don't have to read the whole thing all the way through, but we've got some nice headings in there for you to be able to grab. Oh yeah, I wanted to talk about opportunity cost, right? So yeah, let me finish my thought there. So the notion was that, by me, that lucrum cessans or damnum emergens wasn't me not forthcoming with the payment at the end of the loan, right? And this is McCall's specific example about what this meant, okay, in his legal writing. So what some folks have tried to do, and one of them is the very popular blog Zippy Catholic, rest in peace Zippy. So we're not speaking of ill of the dead or anything, but I think there's a mistake made there in that there's this, and Zippy doesn't do this, but a lot of people do. In fact, Zippy's very good on this specific part, but I think he makes some other mistakes. but on this idea of lucrum cessans is, what folks try to do is they equate that with opportunity cost, right? So it's like, well, you lent to me, so that means you couldn't do something with that specific money in some other investment, right? And what we say is that, this is not opportunity cost, right? There's a very different concept here between the fact that you gave me some money instead of putting it in the stock market, right? Let's say, okay, so that's opportunity cost, right? It's like, what was the highest valued next best alternative, right? So if you gave me $100, to do whatever I needed to do instead of putting it in the market, right? So the idea behind, opportunity cost as justifying interest is that, okay, well, because I lent to you, well, you owe me, right, a return that's close to what I could have gotten in the market, right? You see what I'm saying? And we make all these adjustments for, risk and all these different things. Fine. And when we say risk, we're talking about sort of risk of default, not risk of the underlying, business. Again, it's default risk. It's not the risk I was talking about before. So we have this challenge where, we have these people trying to equate this. And what I think, Zippy does a great job. And I think in our paper, we also mentioned this, is that this whole idea of opportunity cost as justifying, additional payment on a loan is condemned. And Zippy's point is very sort of Thomas Aquinas, very, very much in line with Thomas Aquinas. He says, that this is not a real thing. It's not an ontologically real thing, right? It's just a counterfactual. Well, the counterfactual is no more, is only morally relevant if the underlying moral principle makes it so, right? And in this case, it's not, right? So lucrum cessans is not opportunity cost. They are not the same thing. Lucrum cessans is me reneging on the contract. It's not something intrinsic to the contract.
Okay, so this is difficult. This is such a difficult topic, unfortunately, because
it is,
and it's unfortunate that it's complex, because everybody who lives in America or Europe is going to interact with some sort of interest. Yeah. And so it's very important that we understand this, but it's a shame that it's such a complex topic. So I sent that particular paper to the chat. Take a look at that. And let me try to boil it down if I can try to do this. So
long-winded professor here, so sorry.
This is a lot of great detail here. So if I can understand, so what is meant by intrinsic is basically all things being equal, there's no particular loss to the creditor except for his money per se. He's giving his money, he's loaning it. Mm-hmm. So that's the only loss in consideration at all. Putting interest on that is intrinsic. Whereas all these other types of losses, which could be detrimental to your arrangements or whatever, would you consider that explanation to be a distinction that would work here?
Yeah, I would say so. And this is another thing that McCall says, right? And so he's very much writing as a lawyer. So you can kind of see that when you read his paper, which is available freely. There's no paywall for that paper. So that's really good. And there's a link in our publication to that. So, so the thing is what Vix Prevented does, it says there's something intrinsic to the contract and there's something that is not intrinsic to the contract or extrinsic, right? So it's outside the contract, right? So what they say is that you can receive money, right? If you're the lender, you can receive money above the amount lent for reasons that are not intrinsic to the contract, okay? And so what do we mean by not intrinsic to the contract? What we mean is me paying you back late, right? So if you lent me money, the contract just says, Timothy loans Levi $100 and Levi pays Timothy back in 2 weeks, right? That's the contract. If anything in that contract says, and then Levi also pays another $5 or whatever, right? That is condemned as usurious, right? Period. And that today is what we call interest. That is interest, right? So if then I'm, doing something beyond the contract, right? Extrinsic to the contract, not intrinsic. I'm not paying you back, right? If I don't pay you back at the end of the contract, I mean, what else could be relevant to a contract, right? To a loan contract, right? If I don't pay you back on time, well, okay, because that's not intrinsic to the contract, me paying you extra because I was late, right? What do we call that in modern finance, right? We call that a late fee, right? We call that, we call it a fee, right? Mm-hmm. It's not interest. It's a fee. It's totally different. They're not the same thing. And if you decide, right, Timothy decides he's very good at, sort of doling out money, right, and then receiving it back. So, then we have the issue of Lateran 5 bringing about something called the Montes pietatis, and again, German, not Latin, but. The issue is, if we want to have an institution that is going to dole out some loans to people, sort of how is it going to operate if it can't recoup the cost of doing business, right? So in this case, again, we would have to, we would probably have to consult, a canonist on this. But I think what's interesting about the Montes pietatis is essentially what they're doing is they're operating on fees, right? So if I borrow money from, the Timothy Flanders Montes pietatis or whatever, you can recoup the cost of, shuffling the paper around or whatever, right? The things that you got to do to run this operation. But that doesn't mean you can charge me, 29% interest. Okay. And here's the other thing too, is the most common, and I don't see this a lot in Catholic circles, but the most common misunderstanding of the term usury is that it is a certain amount of interest, right? It's a certain rate of interest, right? Vix per Venit explicitly, in the clearest possible terms, condemns this idea that it has absolutely nothing to do with the rate of interest charged. It has nothing to do with that. What it has to do with is interest charged, right?
Well, and let me ask one last question, just because this is such a relevant topic to many families. I'm going to give you 3 things, and you tell me whether or not they're usurious. And I'll give you all 3 now, and you can break it down. So, 1, credit card. 2, car or mortgage loan. 3, a checking account.
Right. So, let's see. Credit card, yes, because again, in the contract, right? You get a contract for a credit card. There is an interest rate stated there. So, yes, and see, this is the thing too, is there's no risk, right? I mean, for the most part, people are using credit cards for consumption. They're not using them for businesses, right? So there's not even any underlying risk, right, that Father Pesch talks about. There's not even any underlying risk to talk about anyway, right? It's just, I get a credit card and I buy a fridge, right? Well, there's no risk there, right? I mean, I'm not creating fridges. I'm using a fridge, right? Yeah.
So and let me just clarify that for the viewers. So you're saying that the credit card company does not have a risk with loaning you money.
If I was like, let's say there's the Timothy Flanders, investment agency, right? and let's say I'm a fridge maker. Okay. If you give me a credit card, right, that charges me interest, and I use that credit card to make purchases for my business, right, that's usury. And the reason for that is because intrinsic to the contract, right, in the contract is stated that I have to pay interest. And you, as the lender, right, in modern finance, you as the lender do not take any risk on the underlying business, right? You're not taking any risk on the manufacturing of, I'm supposed to pay you interest every month or every quarter or whatever, no matter what.
Right.
And so my business is.
Okay. And I can call in the loan, and if you don't pay up, I can then I can use the state to enforce the contract and take away your home or whatever. And this is why people quote E. Michael Jones, but he's actually quoting Pesch. Pesch is the one who says that capitalism is a state-sponsored usury, which is where that critique came from.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of ink spilled on the internet over this issue of recourse. And what happens is we get very specific about, a very specific definition of the term mutuum. And so then this is all sort of, I think we show this in the paper. This is all incorrectly exploded into some massive long-winded discussion about all the particulars of the loan. But again, Vix per Venit says very clearly, the only way you can receive money over and above the amount, the amount of the actual loan itself is for something extrinsic to the contract, right? So it's just, you can't state interest in there at all, right? So credit cards, definitely usurious.
Okay.
Your second one was cars or home mortgages, right? So mortgage is actually a technical term for, a durable asset and paying out and over time, right? People take out mortgages on their phones all the time, right? I mean, that's what a mortgage is. But yeah, so we have to think about this again in the same context, right? Number one, are we dealing with risk? No, we're not dealing with any risk, right? My home is for me to live in. My car is for me to drive. It has nothing to do with, some kind of, venture, some kind of entrepreneurial activity that has risk in it, right? So, these properties used for consumption, certainly that would be usurious, right? We have examples, and Zippy gets into one of these, and I have to find the link as I don't have it on the tip of my brain here, but Zippy discusses a situation where essentially sort of like a feudal kind of situation where there's these rich folks who loan, some land and all of this stuff to a group of people, right? And the group of people are supposed to give some of the product to the one who's loaning it, right? So first of all, you can't even really call that a loan because that's what in the paper we refer to as a commodatum. Okay, that's me lending you something, right? That's no different than me giving you a hammer for the next couple days, right? It's just that it's instead of a hammer, it's a house and land and property and productive stuff, right? So this gets misconstrued into thinking that, because it's a productive asset, we can lend on it, right? So like, let's say, I was borrowing money for a car, but then I was going to use that car in my business, right? So there's some confusion out there that says that, okay, that is, it's okay to charge interest on that. Again, no, because a loan in today's terms does not share in the risk of the underlying business. It's not sharing in that risk, right? It's an expense. That interest is an expense item. It's not profit sharing. And so then your last example was a savings account, right? So McCall treats this very specifically when he talks about partnerships, right? So we have partnerships these days where, if you don't want to run your business all by yourself, maybe you bring someone in as a general partner, or as in some cases, right, as a limited partner, right, to invest money in your business. And, maybe they, a limited partner, they have certain rights and stuff like this, but, that partner is putting money in the business, and then they are exposed to the risk of the business itself, right? If Timothy Flanders is making refrigerators and I invest in Timothy Flanders refrigerators business, right? And, your business goes belly up, well, I lose money, right? Because I'm a partner. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, traditionally speaking, in terms of deposit account, if watch It's a Wonderful Life, right? If I deposit money with the bank and then there's a run on the bank and the bank loses money, I lost too, right? So I'm sharing in the risk, right? So McCall, I think very correctly, puts depositum, and that's, again, a German pronouncing Latin, puts that in the same category as this partnership, right? Because you're sharing in the risk. Now, what's interesting and specific about that today? Well, we have the FDIC, right? The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that insures a certain amount, and I can't remember what the amount is, but maybe $250,000 or something like that, insures these deposit accounts, right? And it doesn't just have to be savings, right? It could be a checking account, right? It insures these things. And so the risk is not, but see, the risk is, that's taking a risk from the bank and from you, right? So I'm not really sure where that puts us, right, with regard to these things, because who's taking the risk now, right? It's essentially that the government's kind of socializing the risk, right? Because if the bank goes under and they make everybody whole, well, where did that money come from, right? they just print it and inflate, and create inflation and stuff. So, but yeah, that would be my as simple as I can get for your.
and one point that I wanted to bring up too here, because St. Thomas does say that suffering usury is not a sin, but actively practicing usury is the sin. So,
yeah, and I think that you can get into cases where someone's very imprudent, right, and they're just spending lots of money and they don't care about the, taking interest on, or excuse me, they don't care about credit cards and whatever, and they're just blowing money like crazy, right? So I think that would fit into some kind of case, like just at the very least imprudence, right? So I think there's something to be said for that. And I think also we should say that, just because, I'm under some kind of usurious contract doesn't justify me putting that usury on someone else, right? Mm-hmm. So there could be situations like that where I'm loaning out, I'm letting someone use my house and I'm paying for interest on the loan so that I make them pay me, that interest as well.
I just didn't want anybody to get scrupulous about having a mortgage or
no, yeah,
no,
and the thing is,
there's no way to have a home without a mortgage these days.
Yeah, these days, yeah. See, this is where it goes back to what Pius XI says, right? He says, if this cannot always be done under existing circumstances, social justice demands that changes be introduced as soon as possible. Now, he's talking specifically about wages for a family, but I mean, we can apply this to homes as well, right? Well, okay, then come up with some other way to do it, right? This is the only choice you have, right? It's either have a mortgage or pay ridiculously inflated rental prices, right? Mm-hmm. Those are your two options. Both of those are terrible,
Here's a question on usury, and I'd like to get you back to just price and whatever you want to continue on that. But here's one last question on usury. Thomas Keller says, what's extrinsic? If paying the lent money back late plus a late penalty isn't formally interest, then it's functionally interest. So obviously you are paying a little bit more. Why is that not usury?
Yeah, right. So we get to this. This is a very favored trick of the Austrians, right? Is that we become very anti-realist, right? So, if we can say that a fee that you pay a lender is the same thing as interest, I mean, I can express it mathematically, right? I can express them all equivalently mathematically. But the point is, one of them is in the contract and the other one isn't, right? I mean, the contract itself says, that you are to pay this much interest, right? Whereas the fee is for breaking the contract, right? If you break the contract, then something happens, right? So just because we can use mathematics to express all these things the same way doesn't mean that ontologically they're the same thing, right?
Okay, absolutely. Okay, so you said you wanted to get into more just price, just wage, or any other parts of it you want to get into to try to explain before we get more questions later.
Yeah, so I think the just wage thing. I mean, we talked a little bit about this, and I think again the indication, and this is one of the problems we have, right? Is that we hear, oh well, these encyclicals aren't infallible, so we don't have to follow them. And it's like, hey, look, this is pretty consistent stuff. I mean, we're getting the same thing from the popes for the last 140 years. We can't just say that this stuff is something we don't have to listen to, right? And just because there are trade-offs, doesn't mean that doesn't mean that we should prioritize those trade-offs, right? GDP growth or something like that over the moral precepts that the church is clearly telling us is important, right? So the just wage, could that cause, is there a short-term problem where we get, unemployment issues, we get, businesses trying to, readjust to this and figure out how to respond? Sure. Absolutely. And as one of my friends, one of the co-authors on our usury paper points out, that in the US, there's something like $750,000, I think either per person or per household in terms of net wealth. Like, so net of debt, right? But yet what is the average person's actually, so then find the person in the middle, right? What is the median person? What is their net wealth, right? I mean, it could very well be negative these days, right? So how is that? I mean, again, how is that a just system? It's like, oh, well, that's just the product of the market. And it's like, yeah, okay, well, if that's the case, then forget the market. Like, as Pius XI says, we got to make changes. Changes should be introduced as soon as possible. Is Pius XI a socialist? I don't think so. So we get into just price, and just price is very interesting. There's a lot of discussion about, was a just price some kind of, fixed amount, right? So if we talk about just price, and often we hear the criticism is, oh, well, if you set the price too high or too low, then you end up with a shortage or with a surplus, right? I mean, this is very Econ 101 stuff, right? You draw the supply and demand curves, and then you put your price floor in or your price ceiling in, and you show that there's a shortage, there's too much demand, or there's a surplus, right? There's too much supply. And so, the first thing I would say is that, who cares if, for a short period of time, there is a shortage or a surplus. I mean, that's not the end of the world, right? If it's a longer term condition, then we have to start thinking about, okay, are we talking about things that are necessities, or are we talking about things that aren't necessities, right? So maybe we should have some kind of bounds, legal bounds, around the prices of things that are necessities. And as Pesh notes in his book that I've been plugging, the just price is not a fixed amount; it's a range that's allowed, again, typically for necessities, right? So it's if you read Dempsey's work on this, there's some discussion about it's determined by the community. Right. So this is what the medieval authors are telling us. Right. So Augustine, it's determined by the community, and it's, and from a practical perspective, right, it has to be enforced by the state, which, again, we're not afraid of that. We're not afraid of someone calling us, a communist, because, again, the state has legitimate authority from, biblical teaching. So can we have some kind of, bounds around just prices for things? I think that makes perfect sense, right? And so I think the most sophisticated criticism you would get comes again from sort of the libertarian side, which is to say that let the market set the price itself, let it deal with prices, let markets work, and then deal with the distributional consequences on the back end. So in other words, if let's say a toaster oven is a necessity, right? And the average toaster oven is too expensive for, families in the bottom quintile of incomes, right? Then what we do is let the market price toaster ovens, right? And even if it's too expensive for those people who are relatively poor, right? We call it a necessity, and we just give them money to pay for it, right? And of course, the problem here is that, it actually matters if you work for the things you have, right? This is, again, why Rerum Novarum spends so much time talking about, the head of a family, working and providing for his family, right? We shouldn't be, we shouldn't have all of our needs taken care of for us by the state, right? I mean, that's socialism, that's communism, right? Then we're talking about socialism. No, we're talking about work is a good thing. It shouldn't be everything you do. It shouldn't be the main thing in your life, right? The main thing in your life is your family and your community, right? But it's important, and it's a good thing for you to do it, and for you to, again, I mean, you want to talk about E. Michael Jones, right? The civilizational force in Europe were the Benedictines, right? And they taught my ancestors in Germany how to work, right? These. It's obviously a good thing. And when you work, you should be able to buy the things that you need, right? And again, I would say to these economists who are going to tell me, oh, well, let the market price things and then deal with the distributional consequences. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, I get that, you want to make some argument about sort of efficiency of markets and wisdom of crowds, or what, however you want to say this. But, if we include, if we say that, okay, GDP would be 10% lower, or 20% lower because we're not letting markets work, right? We're imposing just prices on certain things. Okay, fine. Well, then maybe the redistributional thing needs to be, to not let the top 1% accumulate such a massive amount of wealth. Again, a lot of times through the actions of the state themselves. I'm not going to sit here and say that everything that needs to be done to improve the world is more regulation, right? There's certainly bad policies, bad regulations. I mean, Social Security, I think, single-handedly almost has completely obliterated the family, right? The extended family. It's evil. It's disgusting. And so getting rid of that as soon as possible would be fantastic in my mind. So there's certainly points of agreement with the libertarians, but my goodness, the just price is more than just about, GDP per capita, for Pete's sake.
Mm-hmm. Now the Austrians contend that the Salamancan school is what sort of invented the market price. There's quotations in Tom Wood's book where he quotes various authors in that school and says they say such things as, well, the price should be determined by nothing but the market. What do you think of the Salamancan school and that assertion of the Austrians?
Yeah. So on my Twitter account, which is let's see, at Catholic Econ, and that's the Twitter account for my podcast. The other day I said something like I ruffled some feathers, saying, you shouldn't put the speculative writing of theologians and saints, no matter how wonderful they were, over the authority of the Pope, right? And the authority of the magisterium. So yeah, did the Salamancans come up with, all these ideas? Sure, maybe so, right? But who cares? Just because, they came up with this idea of how prices work or how prices can make things efficient, right? Or how prices reflect, scarcities very precisely, right? And demands very precisely. Okay, sure, right? I mean, that's like saying, okay, well, I discovered, I discovered a very efficient killing machine, right? I discovered the atom bomb. Well, my discovery of that doesn't make me correct, right? I mean, who cares? If the Pope is saying, we should, and again, right, changes should be introduced as soon as possible to rectify these wrongs. Well, then who am I going to listen to, right? I'm not going to listen to some guy in Spain. I'm going to listen to the Pope because he's the Pope, because I'm Catholic.
Okay. Fair enough. I've got a few objections.
Sure.
And I'd like to get to those and some other questions. Do you want to say more on some Catholic social teaching basics? We didn't talk. We could talk more about just wage or any other aspects of it.
So the one thing I want to do before we do questions, because I'd rather do questions, is I want to finish a quote. So you in the links for this episode, you put my book review of Trent Horn and Catherine Pakaluk's book, Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? And in that, and in your interview earlier this week, there was the reading of a quote from JP2 in Solicitudo Rei Socialis. I think I got that one right. That I think needs to be completely stated. So I'm going to stop when we heard, I'm going to stop for the short part that we heard from these two sources, and then I'm going to finish it. Okay. So JP2 says, the church's social doctrine is not a third way between liberal capitalism and Marxist collectivism. That's all we got. Right. So does that make it seem like distributism is a bad thing, or that it's, because it's some third position or whatever, because we can bring up complaints about, Chancellor Dollfuss or whatever, right? Does that mean that, distributism is wrong, or that, the people who are attempting to sort of put liberal capitalist ideas sort of secondary, right, to the important practical principles taught to us by the popes, does that make us bad or outside of things or whatever, right? No, of course, because here's what we do, right? So we finish the quote. Nor even a possible alternative to other solutions less radically opposed to one another. Rather, it constitutes a category of its own. Nor is it an ideology, but rather the accurate formulation of the results of a careful reflection on the careful realities of human existence in society and in the international order in light of faith and of the church's tradition. Right? So again, yeah, it's not a third way between the two. No, it's understanding the importance of the moral teaching of the church and putting that first when we have these conversations about policy and about how things ought to work and about how we ought to behave as fathers, as members of communities. We're putting the church's moral teaching first, right? And so maybe we're picking things that someone could characterize as part of Marxist collectivism, or someone could characterize as part of liberal capitalism. But when we're making these, judgment calls on the application of these policies, we're doing it because the church tells us this is what's important.
Okay, I like that. That's good. That's good. Well, speaking of Marxism, Marxism and socialism seem to be the biggest critiques, an accusation of socialism. Here's what one chat says: Levi's definition of distributism, the proper principle of Catholic social teaching, is not the same as Belloc. They never cite the magisterium in Distributist works. It was a Fabian invention.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, if that's what you think, then go read everything Belloc wrote and tell me that it's totally inconsistent with Catholic social teaching at the time. I mean, like, again, this is like, it's like I'm supposed to, again, are there better terms? Yes. Belloc said there were better terms, right? Chesterton didn't even like the term distributism. They were just trying to come up with something. It's not Fabian socialism. That's totally ridiculous. If you're saying that, then you're saying that Heinrich Pesch was a Fabian socialist, and that everything that the popes have told us, right? Belloc and Chesterton were making probably a very honest effort to implement Catholic social teaching. And again, did some of it sound like Fabian socialism to somebody? Sure, whatever, right? But that doesn't make it Fabian socialism, right? It's applying the church's teaching. Maybe we get it wrong, but we don't get it wrong because, Tom Woods and, Milton Friedman say it's wrong. Well, who cares about those guys, right? I care about what the Pope says. So it's all about trade-offs. And again, I refuse to be pinned down to what two guys said 100 years ago.
Sure.
There's so much more literature. There's so much more to read.
Now, what about the accusation that Marx's labor theory of value is, because just for viewers, the idea of the labor theory of value is the idea that all the value of an economy should be based on labor, because that is a person doing something, and that's the ultimate value. Whereas, like, I think, if I'm not incorrect, GDP is more of a value of productive money, or maybe there's just more of a money-based value system versus the labor-based. So what would you say to that? Isn't that a Marxist idea?
Well, so, what's interesting about labor theory of value. So, I'm not a philosopher, so I didn't learn labor theory of value the way a philosopher is going to describe it, right? I learned it as this was the classical perspective on the way markets are supposed to be measured, right? So Adam Smith, also held to some version of the labor theory of value, and the idea was simply that, and this is how Marx got his, surplus value perspective, right? And Pesch talks about surplus value, but Pesch, I think, does a good job of making some very important changes to that concept. So, but the point here is that, the labor theory of value says that, whatever it costs to make this thing, right, in terms of the physical, buying the physical things and then having someone glue them together or whatever, right? Whatever the process is for this, right? That is the value of this. That the market transactions, right? In other words, the valuations of the buyers and sellers have nothing to do with it, right? And so that's where Marx says, well, if it's in excess of the cost of it to be produced, then that is unjust, right? And that surplus value should be returned to the laborers, right? To the workers. Now, do I think labor is an important thing and it's a central part of the Pope's teachings, or the Pope's teachings? Absolutely, right? That doesn't mean I'm a Marxist. Okay, the labor theory of value, I think we have in modern economics, we have the value in use and the value in trade, right, or the market value of something. And what's important here is that if we're going to understand these two things, the best example I think is this. Let's say that I'm in a desert and I've been in the desert for 3 weeks and I'm almost dead. I'm crawling up to you, right? and you're right on the edge of the desert, and you've got a bottle of water, right? And you say, oh, well, you would be willing to pay $500 for this sip of water so that you can survive, right? Does that mean it's just for you to charge me $500 for that bottle of water? No, right? The value and use of that water is still the same as it was, today, whenever I've, got a cup right here, right? The use of that water, the value of that use of that water is completely different sometimes than what someone is willing to pay or willing to buy, right? And so Bernard Dempsey has a great paper on this. And if someone wants to contact me, I'll send you the paper. But it's very interesting. It's very difficult to come up with just this just price stuff. But just because it's difficult to come up with, or there are, judgment calls to be made, doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done, right? So that's where, that's where I would answer that.
Okay. All right. So any other questions? I know I've got a few questions that I'll get to in just a second. I want to cover one more objection, and if anybody in the chat wants to ask any more objections or questions. But here is a quotation from Quod Apostolici Muneris. I think that's Leo the 13th, 1878. Paragraph 9. He says, the socialists would destroy the right of property, alleging that the property and the privileges of the rich may be rightly invaded. The church, with much greater wisdom and good sense, recognizes the inequality among men must not be touched and stands inviolate. So the objection is that Leo XIII is saying here that the socialist wants to basically rob the rich and give to the poor using taxes or revolution or whatever. And setting aside what you've already stated, that not everything Belloc Chesterton says is correct, and that's not really representative of the best of distributism. Taking that into consideration, what would you say to the objection that distributism is trying to redistribute by doing this very thing that Leo XIII condemns?
Yeah. So, I mean, here's the thing, right? So so that's perfectly good stuff to say, right? That makes total sense. I'm 100% with Leo XIII on that point. But how do we make that make sense with the other things that he's said? How do we make that make sense with the things that he says in Rerum Novarum, where he says that, the employer owes a just wage to the employee? How do we make that make sense with the concept of the universal destination of goods? Right? That the idea that we're allowed to have, these property rights systems to again, to rightly progress the economy, right? To make us all better off, hopefully. But that doesn't mean that, the universal destination of goods means that the property rights are not completely inviolate, right? John Paul II says that property rights are under what he calls the social mortgage, right? So that's his term for this idea that this practical idea that you have to figure out how to respect the universal destination of goods and respect private property. But of course, one of those is more fundamental than the other, right? And so, obviously we don't want Marxist revolution, right? And we don't want the government unjustly taking from certain people and giving to others, right? Because we are all different, right? We all do have different ability levels. And that not everyone should be, we shouldn't level everything, right? But there are, again, we're talking about the basic necessities, right? Go back to what I was talking about with Warren Cass, right? The cost of thriving index, right? He's talking about the basics. He's talking about having a normal life, right? He's not talking about, buying 5 BMWs and 3 boats, right? He's talking about procuring the normal things for life. And we're at the point where we're proof texting, one line from an encyclical to try to defeat, clear representation of the teaching, in multiple encyclicals over the last 150 years. It's just silly to me.
Yeah, it's a good answer. It reminds me of when St. Thomas talks about alms, and there's actually this very exact objection what he brings up. He says, well, it's my own property. Why shouldn't I just be able to do whatever I want with it? And St. Thomas says, well, it is your own property, but you don't own the exclusive right of the use of that property. So it is your property. There's an ownership of it, but there is a certain ownership that the poor have over your excess. So whatever you have above your necessities, above what you need, that belongs to the poor, according to St. Thomas and the fathers of the church. So that's a very important point.
You're not giving them something you own. You're giving them something that they deserve, that they should have.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. So here's one question. Vox Populi says, what is the distributist position of public works that create value?
Public works that create value. So I guess you're saying things like roads, right? Where
here's another question kind of put the same way. What role does the state play in the life of the nation? Like, because you're saying you reject the non-aggression principle, which is what the Austrians say, that the state should only basically prohibit and enforce or against violence, fraud, and theft. So that's kind of the big three or whatever, if you will. Whereas you're saying that the church says that the state has more responsibilities.
Yeah, so I would say the state has authority, right? And so that automatically takes the non-aggression principle and throws it in the trash. So that's the first step, right? Now, the other thing is that the state has responsibilities, right? We look to subsidiarity to understand and solidarity as well, right? The sort of the goodwill, one willing the good for another, right? But subsidiarity is very important here, right? So subsidiarity basically says that the larger or more distant political entity should not interfere in the appropriate work of lower entities, but should seek to facilitate coordination, right? So what is the fundamental unit of society? It's the family, right? Period, end of story, right? And so a lot of modern economics is sort of silly because it's all based on individuals, right? So what is the fundamental unit of society? The family, right? So what should the family do? Well, the family should provide for the basics of life, right? Should provide for what is, sort of an ordinary kind of living in the society you live in, right? And to the extent that the family is not able to do all of that, right, then a larger body or a more distant body, right, like the town or the county that you live in, right, it has certain things that it must do. So, just empirically speaking, in the U.S., right, we have county and state level coordination for schooling, right? Now, is that necessary? Is it better that the church does it? Is it better that it's done at home? Okay, yeah, maybe, right? But these are things that we can have discussions about where it's appropriate. What role should the state play in the life of the nation? So, I mean, maybe if we want to go all the way up to the national level, right? So this makes a ton of sense. Like international policy, like international trade, right? Obviously, individual states or individual counties or families really don't have much concern over that. Like, in a democratic system like we have, where we have to vote, okay, yeah, you're obligated to come up with some kind of reasoning for voting for who you're voting for. But it's not really your job to worry about international trade policy or the high level discussions about war and international relations, right? So it's sort of we use subsidiarity. We use subsidiarity to sort of understand what level these things are appropriate to. But we also, just as a practical point, and this is more speculative on my end, but I mean, the reality is of subsidiarity is that, well, somebody has to decide what's appropriate for each level, right? And so obviously, ideally, the church would tell us that. But, there are, I think it's practical in some sense for the highest level of governance to have some kind of influence on what the other levels are able to do.
Okay, absolutely. So this will be my last question, and then I would like to get your final thoughts. So Sean Morrissey says, if lenders do not charge interest, why would they lend? And then he asks about, does the church prohibit all usury or just exorbitant usury? You did answer the second part earlier when you said that all interest, which is charged intrinsic to the loan, is usurious, period. But there are extrinsic titles, extrinsic things that you discussed. There's a link, Sean, if you go to that, I'll put it in the show notes as well. The paper that Dr. Levi mentioned, which may clear that up a little bit. But the first question is, if lenders do not charge interest, why would they lend? How do we even get a house at this point if we can't do this?
Yeah. So I think that the answer to a lot of these difficult questions is that we have to make a lot of changes. We can't just make one change, right? Like one policy change isn't going to solve some of these more complicated issues. But so if lenders don't charge interest, why would they lend? Well, again, this goes back to the idea of the Montes pietatis, right? So in McCall's work, he discusses the idea that government bonds are not usurious because the interest charged on those bonds falls under the it falls under the power of the state to tax, right? So this idea of the state having authority is very important when we get into some of these issues. So, for instance, right, so the government could fund a Montes pietatis, right? I mean, the state of North Dakota has a state bank, and the rates are set by the state. And I would imagine that at least some of the capital comes from taxes, not all of it probably, but that would be one way to do it, right? Would be to create this lender that is essentially financed, whose capital is essentially financed by, interest as taxation, right? But Christ says, if your friend asks you for your shirt, for his shirt, give him your coat too, right? So, why would we lend? Well, because we love our brothers, right? That's why.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the Mons Pietatis, that it was basically a nonprofit organization that was designed to just help people who are in need, basically the poor.
Let me throw another thing in here. So I did my PhD research on cooperatives, and I think one of the most wonderful things that we could use more of, and to at least push things in the right direction, would be to use the credit union more often, right? So a credit union. I'm an owner of the union itself. I'm not just a borrower in a transaction with a bank, right? So the credit union itself it's a group of us putting money together, and then the credit union itself doles out a loan, right? So that's a way for a sort of civil society approach to making a loan that you would need to have.
Excellent. Any final thoughts on distributism, Catholic social teaching?
Yeah. So my thing is do yourself a favor and read the social encyclicals. Read Rerum Novarum, read Quadragesimo Anno, read Centisimus Annus, read the whole thing, and ask yourself, right, if you're more on this libertarian side of things, ask yourself if there's not a very plain, consistent teaching in there about some very important things that we are told often by the more libertarian types that we are not allowed to do, right? Socialism is very clearly and obviously condemned. And one of the, I think it wouldn't be too much to call this an excuse. One of the excuses made to push everything into some kind of libertarian night watchman state or anarcho-capitalist or whatever is something that JP2 says in Centisimus Annus. He says, if by capitalism we mean, this free for all that hurts everybody, right, then we don't want that. But if we're talking about capitalism as, and again, I don't have the quote right in front of me, but essentially he says, if by capitalism we mean, this set of market transactions that occur within a strong juridical framework, right? So, well, what is that strong juridical framework, right? What does that strong juridical framework look like? Well, it looks like things like, a family wage. It looks like implementing the just price. It looks like a ban on usury. It looks like reinstituting authentic community and the importance of the extended family, right? It looks like abolishing silly things like Social Security that just degrade the family, right? I didn't have much time to talk about that, but check out my podcast. I'm going to talk about Social Security in the next week or two, maybe. These are this is very clear. I think if you read these encyclicals, then an octogesima adviens, or I don't know how to say it, but that's another one to read. We are told what this strong juridical framework is supposed to look like, and it's not Milton Friedman's Night Watchman state.
Absolutely. Yeah. I just, let me just read this whole thing real quick. The quote from Centisimus annus.
Thanks.
Paragraph 42. So this is 1991, fall of the Soviet communists. And he says, quote, "Can it perhaps be said that after the failure of communism, capitalism is the victorious social system, and that capitalism should be the goal of the countries now making efforts to rebuild their economy and society?" And then he talked about should the third world, so-called, adopt capitalism. And then he says this, quote, "If by capitalism is meant an economic system which recognizes the fundamental and positive role of business, the market, private property, and the resulting responsibility of the means of production, as well as free human creativity in the economic center, then the answer is certainly in the affirmative, even though it would perhaps be more appropriate to call it business." Okay, so he talks about some other terms, but then he says, but if by capitalism is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector is not circumscribed with a strong juridical framework, which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality, and which sees it as a particular aspect of that freedom, the core of which is ethical and religious, then the reply is certainly negative. And then he goes on to talk about how, yes, Marxism has failed, but there's also the similar issues in the West, in the capitalist West, where he talks about alienation. He distinguishes between exploitation, where people are starving, whatever, the so-called wage slavery, but then he just distinguishes that with alienation, which is the prevalent social ill in the Western capitalist societies that he identifies. So that's any further, do you want to comment more on that, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that, if you read that in the context of, it's called Centesimus Annus because it's the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, right? It used to be the case that there was a celebration every 10 years after Rerum Novarum because it was so important. That encyclical was so important in 1891. And so, if we think about JP2's writing in Centesimus Annus in light of that, in light of the fact that he's celebrating Rerum Novarum, right? So again, and he talks about, in service to, sort of like, right, that freedom is this religious concept, right? So again, it's not a bunch of atheists in, the Enlightenment telling us that we should just be able to do whatever the heck we want as long as we're not killing someone, right? I mean, that's just silly, right? This is absolutely not what the Catholic Church talks about in terms of what is a justifiable moral system, right? So that strong juridical framework has to look like, what the popes have told us it needs. There's certain outcomes that need to be taken into account.
Absolutely.
Thanks for reading that, by the way. That was the one I didn't have.
Yeah, that's a great consideration to talk about. So Dr. Levi, thanks so much for coming on. Everybody take a look at Leo Institute. That links below in the show notes, but it's leoinstitute.org. leoinstitute.org for Catholic social teaching. What are your plans for the Leo 9 Institute?
Man, we got a lot of stuff coming. We're going to continue to put out policy papers, which are these longer, sort of more academic-y kind of discussions. We're going to have some more position papers, which is meant to be short and meant to be, us staking out a position on a specific topic with the eye toward, sending this to a politician or something like that. We have our 2020 presidential election guide that we're going to be doing an update on. And, I can't say much more, but we've got a lot of big stuff in the works. And so hopefully, our day jobs allowing, right? Anthony Stein, who does Return to Tradition, he's our interim director right now. So he's also greatly involved. He's finishing up his PhD in political philosophy, I think. So, the two of us with our 5 research associates we have right now, working on a lot of cool stuff, and we're going to have a lot more coming. Oh, that's right. We have a magazine that will be out. We've sort of solicited articles from a range of people. And so we're going to do a magazine that will be out in September. We're planning on to do that quarterly. And then we've got some other big stuff coming probably around the first of the year, I'm hoping.
Excellent. Yeah, so everybody check that out. You can also follow Dr. Levi at Catholic Econ, and that is the what's the name what's the name of the podcast? Catholic Economics?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
Yep. Catholic Economics. It's on all the podcast platforms, and it's also on YouTube.
Excellent. Okay. Well, Dr. Levi, we always close with Our Father, so let's offer up an Our Father for, especially for the poor in this COVID-1984 situation. Whatever our economic persuasion within the bounds of orthodoxy, we need to think about the poor first. And like we talked about, your excess wealth belongs to them. So be sure to help your neighbor, especially the elderly who can't get out or may be really at risk for COVID. And people who are losing their jobs because of this situation. So let's remember them, and let's offer up an Our Father for an economy that gives greater glory to God.
Agreed.
Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, the Holy Spirit.